using your uploaded role/style guide as the writing framework. In 1483, two boys were placed behind the walls of the Tower of London. Not prisoners, officially. Not corpses, not yet. One was Edward V, England's uncrowned child king. The other was his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York. They were seen at windows, then less often, then hardly at all. And then without a trial, without a funeral, without a grave anyone could prove. They vanished from the record. Two children with royal blood. Two living threats. Two names England has never quite managed to bury. But before the Tower became the center of accusation, it was something more complicated. A royal residence, a fortress, a symbol of protection, ceremony, and fear, depending entirely on who held the keys. So we begin not with certainty, because certainty is exactly what this story refuses to give us. We begin with a disappearance, and with the strange, cold space it left behind. Imagine London in the summer of 1483, a city used to pageantry, rumor, and sudden reversals of fortune. Beyond the river and the crowded streets stood the Tower, ancient even then, its walls carrying the weight of kings before these boys were born. Inside were Edward and Richard, sons of Edward IV, heirs of the House of York, children who should have been prepared for coronation robes, not watched by men whose loyalties shifted with the weather of politics. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Because the mystery of the princes in the Tower is not simply a tale of murder. It is a story about power becoming quiet, about how a kingdom can misplace two children when those children stand between ambition and a crown. And after more than 5 centuries, the question remains where it began. Behind closed doors, inside stone walls, with no final witness brave enough to speak. To understand why two boys could become so dangerous simply by existing, we have to step back from the Tower and look at the bloodline that placed them there. England in the late 15th century was not a peaceful stage on which kings politely waited their turn. It was a country still bruised by the Wars of the Roses, a long and bitter struggle between rival branches of the same royal family, Lancaster and York. The name sounds almost decorative now, as if history had arranged the conflict with flowers in mind. But the reality was less elegant. Crowns were claimed, lost, seized again. Noble families changed sides when survival required it. Battles settled arguments that law had failed to contain. At the center of it all stood the Plantagenet inheritance, old, prestigious, and increasingly fragile. In theory, royal succession was meant to give the kingdom order. A clear heir prevented chaos. A child born in the right bed, to the right father, under the right legal conditions, could carry the future of England in his name. But in practice, blood was never enough by itself. A king's son needed recognition. He needed powerful supporters. He needed the appearance of legitimacy, the machinery of government, and the ability to survive the adults who found him inconvenient. That is what makes Edward V and his younger brother Richard so important. They were not merely unfortunate children caught in a family tragedy. They were political facts. Edward, as the eldest surviving son of Edward IV, stood first in line to inherit the throne. His brother Richard was not far behind him. Together, they represented continuity for the House of York. Their existence told the kingdom that Edward IV's line had not ended. Whatever fears, rivalries, or resentments moved around them, the simple fact remained. While those boys lived as legitimate sons, other claims to the crown had to bend around them. And this is where the story becomes colder. A medieval prince could be loved, protected, educated, and dressed in fine clothing. He could be spoken of with reverence. He could be carried through ceremonies and surrounded by men who bowed deeply. But he was also a claim in human form. His body was evidence. His name was a banner. His survival could unite a faction, inspire a rebellion, or expose the weakness of another man's crown. Edward V was around 12 years old when his father died. His brother was younger still. By modern instinct, we see children first. The political world of 1483 saw something else at the same time. Heirs, symbols, leverage, threats. That does not mean everyone around them wished them harm. History becomes too easy when every ambitious figure is treated as a villain from the beginning. Some men may have believed they were protecting the realm. Others may have been protecting themselves and calling it duty, which is one of politics' older habits. The problem was that England had already learned, over decades of dynastic conflict, that uncertainty around succession could become lethal very quickly. A child king could be crowned. A child king could also be controlled. And if a child's right to rule became contested, then the question was no longer only who he was. It became who had the power to define him. That was the dangerous inheritance Edward IV left behind. Not simply a throne, but a throne surrounded by men who understood exactly what royal blood could do. His sons were young. Their claim was powerful. And in a kingdom built on bloodlines, that combination was never harmless. When Edward IV died in April of 1483, England did not merely lose a king. It lost the man whose physical presence had held a dangerous arrangement together. Edward had been forceful, charismatic, and politically experienced. He had survived war, exile, betrayal, and return. His reign had not been free of conflict, but by the time of his death, he had given the House of York something precious: the appearance of stability. There was an heir. There was a line of succession. There was, at least on the surface, a path forward. But surface is the important word. Edward V, the new king-in-law, was still a child. He could inherit the title instantly, but he could not yet rule with his own authority. The crown could pass to him in a sentence. Power could not. Power had to be exercised by adults, and adults in royal courts rarely move without interests of their own. Edward IV seems to have understood this danger. Before his death, he named his younger brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector of the realm during the boy king's minority. On paper, this made sense. Richard was a seasoned nobleman, a military commander, and a leading figure of the House of York. He had spent years governing in the north of England, with a reputation for competence and loyalty to his brother. That reputation matters, because it complicates the picture. The Richard who steps into this story is not yet the hunched villain of Tudor drama, gliding toward crime as if born for it. He is a royal duke with real authority, real experience, and a plausible legal role. To many, he may have looked like the safest man to guide the young king through a dangerous transition. Yet the very title, protector, contains the seed of the problem. Protection can be sincere. It can also become possession. A child king creates a vacuum around him. Someone must control access to his person. Someone must decide which advisors are trusted, which letters are answered, which ceremonies move forward, which armed men stand nearby. Whoever holds the child does not simply hold a boy. He holds the visible source of royal legitimacy, and Edward V was not being raised in isolation. At the time of his father's death, he was in the care of relatives and allies connected to his mother, Elizabeth Woodville. The Woodvilles had risen sharply under Edward IV, and many older noble families viewed their influence with resentment or suspicion. Some saw them as ambitious newcomers. Others may have feared that they would dominate the young king and rule through him. So the crisis after Edward IV's death was not only about a crown passing from father to son. It was about who would stand closest to that son. That is often where histories of this period become misleadingly clean. They make it sound as if England faced a simple choice between loyalty and treason, rightful succession and naked ambition. But in the spring of 1483, many of the people involved could have described their actions in respectable language. They could speak of order, good governance, the prevention of faction, the protection of the king's person. Medieval politics was very skilled at dressing fear in legal clothing. Richard of Gloucester's rise as Lord Protector placed him at the center of that fear. If he allowed the Woodvilles to control Edward V, his own influence might collapse. If he moved against them too harshly, he risked appearing to seize power for himself. If he did nothing, the kingdom might divide around a boy who had not yet been crowned, and coronation mattered. Until Edward V was crowned, his authority remained strangely unfinished. He was king by inheritance, but not yet king in the full ceremonial sense that medieval England understood so deeply. The sacred oil had not touched him. The public ritual had not displayed him as God's anointed ruler. That delay created room for maneuver, and in politics, room is rarely left empty for long. The death of Edward IV therefore opened a narrow, dangerous passage. On one side stood lawful succession. On the other stood the practical reality that a child's kingship depended on whoever could command the adults around him. Richard entered that passage as protector. Whether he began as guardian, opportunist, or something in between is still argued. What is clearer is that from the moment Edward IV was gone, the fate of his sons no longer depended only on their blood. It depended on custody, timing, and the men who understood that controlling the king could be almost as powerful as being king. The journey toward London should have been a procession toward certainty. Edward V was the king now, even if uncrowned, and the road south from Ludlow was meant to bring him closer to the rituals that would make his rule visible. A coronation was not a decorative event in this world. It was a public answer to a dangerous question. Who has the right to command? Who may speak in the name of the realm? Who stands beneath the crown without being crushed by it? For a boy of 12, the journey must have carried several meanings at once. There would have been ceremony, expectation, the pressure of adult attention. There may also have been grief, because his father's death was still recent. The child traveling toward London was not only a political symbol. He was a son moving through the first weeks of life without the man whose name had protected him. Around him moved the Woodville connection. His maternal relatives, servants, advisors, and loyal men who had every reason to keep him close. To them, perhaps, this was continuity. The king was in their care. They were escorting him to his capital. The machinery of succession was working. To Richard, Duke of Gloucester, that same scene may have looked very different. If Edward reached London surrounded by Woodville influence, the Protector's authority could become a title without substance. The court might form around the young king before Richard had secured his own position. Once crowned, Edward V would be harder to manage, harder to challenge, and far more dangerous to restrain. In medieval politics, timing was not a background detail. Timing was a weapon. So Richard moved. At Stony Stratford, on the road to London, the shape of the story changed. Richard intercepted the young king's party, and several of the king's companions were arrested, including key Woodville allies. The official explanation could be framed in the language of protection. The boy king was being rescued from corrupt or overmighty advisors. That was not an unusual argument in medieval politics. Again and again, men who wanted access to the monarch claimed they were saving him from other men who wanted access to the monarch. The difficulty is that both things can be true in different proportions. Richard may have genuinely feared Woodville domination. He may also have understood that removing those around Edward placed the king directly under his own control. Motive does not always arrive in history wearing one clear color. Sometimes it comes braided: duty, suspicion, ambition, fear. For Edward himself, the distinction may have mattered less in the moment. One set of adults had been replaced by another. The road to coronation had become a road under supervision. That is the quiet unease at the heart of this stage of the story. Nothing had yet happened that required the darkest interpretation. The young king was not killed on the road. He was not publicly deposed. Richard did not, at this point, simply declare himself king and discard the boy. Instead, events remained wrapped in legality and procedure. Orders were given. Men were detained. The royal journey continued. But the meaning of protection had shifted. Before Stony Stratford, Edward V was traveling as a child king, escorted by those closest to his mother's family. Afterward, he was traveling under the authority of his uncle, the Lord Protector, whose power now depended on keeping rival influences away from him. That change may sound administrative. It was much more than that. Custody of the king was custody of the kingdom's future. London waited ahead, but London was not a neutral place. It was a city of merchants, officials, churchmen, nobles, rumors, and armed retainers. Whoever brought Edward into the capital would help define the story the capital believed. Was this a rightful young king arriving for coronation, or a boy rescued from a faction that had tried to use him? Was Richard the loyal guardian, or had guardianship already begun to harden into control? The evidence does not let us climb inside Richard's mind, and it would be too easy to pretend otherwise. What we can see is the pattern of movement. The king's household was disrupted. His maternal faction was cut away. His uncle took charge of his person. And the coronation, though still expected, now sat under the shadow of a new reality. Edward V was approaching the throne. But from this point onward, he would approach it through doors someone else held open or closed. The Tower of London did not mean one thing. That is important, because the modern imagination tends to flatten it into a prison first and everything else afterward. We picture locked doors, damp cells, condemned nobles waiting for footsteps outside the chamber. The Tower certainly became that kind of place for many people. But it was also a royal fortress, a treasury, an armory, a symbol of state authority, and at times a residence suitable for kings. So when Edward V was lodged there in 1483, it did not immediately announce disaster. A king might stay in the Tower before his coronation. There was precedent and logic in it. From there, he could be prepared for the public ceremony that would display him to London and to God as the rightful ruler of England. On paper, the arrangement could still be explained as protective, ceremonial, even normal. But places gather meaning from circumstance. Edward entered the Tower not as a confident ruler preparing to step into Westminster in triumph, but as a child whose household had already been disrupted, whose closest maternal allies had been arrested or driven into fear, and whose uncle now controlled the path between him and the crown. The walls around him may have been royal walls, but they were walls all the same. Then came his younger brother. Richard, Duke of York, was initially with his mother, Elizabeth Woodville, who had taken sanctuary at Westminster with her daughters and household. Sanctuary was not just hiding in a church and hoping for sympathy. It was a recognized religious protection, a space where violence and arrest were supposed to pause before the authority of the sacred. Elizabeth Woodville had reason to be afraid. She had seen how quickly the political weather changed after her husband's death. The younger prince was eventually brought out of sanctuary and sent to join Edward in the Tower. Officially, this made sense for the approaching coronation. The king's brother might be expected to participate in the ceremony. The royal family should appear united. No one in power wanted the public image of a frightened queen mother barricaded in sanctuary while the boy king moved toward the crown under armed supervision. But again, the explanation and the effect are not the same. Once both boys were inside the Tower, the entire Yorkist succession from Edward IV's body had been gathered into one controlled space. That detail changes the emotional temperature of the story. One prince in the Tower could be called preparation. Two princes in the Tower begins to feel like containment. It is here that the ambiguity becomes almost unbearable. We do not need to imagine immediate cruelty to understand the danger. The boys may have had attendance. They may have been treated according to their rank. They may have played, prayed, eaten, and spoken with no full understanding of the forces closing around them. The tragedy of political captivity is that it can begin politely. A door closes with courtesy. A guard bows. Meals arrive on time. The prisoner is still called "my lord," and yet the choices that mattered were no longer theirs. Edward V, the elder brother, had been born to inherit a kingdom. Richard, the younger, was a reserve claim, another living branch of the same royal tree. In ordinary times, that might have been a source of dynastic comfort. In 1483, it was a problem waiting to be solved by whoever believed the realm could not bear divided loyalties. The Tower made that problem manageable. It separated the boys from the city while keeping them near enough to be displayed if needed. It placed them under watch while preserving the language of royal care. It allowed events outside the walls to accelerate while the children inside became strangely still, like figures in a painting whose frame is being carried away by others. This is one reason the mystery has lasted so long. The early stages do not look like a single dramatic crime. They look like a sequence of defensible decisions that, when placed together, begin to form a cage. A child king escorted to London, a coronation pending, a royal lodging, a younger brother brought for ceremony. Each step could be explained. Each step also reduced the boy's freedom, and the Tower, with its double nature, made the uncertainty worse. Palace or prison, protection or control, preparation or removal. For Edward and Richard, it may have been all of those things at once. The coronation of Edward V was not cancelled in a single thunderclap. It faded by degrees. At first, the plan still seemed to exist. The boy was in London. The crown had not passed elsewhere. Officials could still speak as though the proper ceremony was approaching, as though the interruption at Stony Stratford had been only a disturbance on the road, not a warning about the destination. The realm had seen minority kings before. It knew how to wrap a child in ceremony and let adults govern in his name. But ceremonies depend on confidence. A coronation asks everyone present to agree, at least outwardly, that the person before them possesses a rightful and sacred authority. It does not remove political doubt, but it buries doubt beneath oil, oath, music, cloth of gold, and public recognition. Once performed, it becomes harder to undo. Not impossible. England had proved that often enough, but harder. So delay mattered. Every postponed date gave uncertainty more room to breathe. Every day Edward remained uncrowned. His kingship stayed suspended between inheritance and public consecration. The boy inside the tower was still Edward V, but the ritual that would have made him untouchable in the eyes of many had not yet happened. That gap became the space into which accusation could enter. The question raised against him was not whether he was his father's son in the ordinary sense. It was more dangerous than that. It was whether his parents' marriage had been valid, and therefore whether he and his siblings were legitimate heirs at all. The claim, as it emerged, was that Edward IV had been bound by a previous marriage contract before marrying Elizabeth Woodville. If accepted, that would make the Woodville marriage invalid and the children of that union illegitimate. This was not gossip in a corner once it became attached to power. It was a legal and religious argument with explosive political consequences. In a world where marriage, inheritance, and divine order were woven tightly together, legitimacy was not a private family matter. It was the foundation under the throne. Here, caution is essential. The allegation served Richard's interests very neatly. That does not automatically prove it was invented from nothing. Medieval dynastic politics often produced claims that were partly legal, partly theological, partly opportunistic, and entirely useful to someone. What we can say is that the challenge to Edward's legitimacy transformed the situation. The issue was no longer simply who should govern during the boy's minority. It became whether the boy had any right to be king at all. And once that question was allowed into the open, the logic of the crisis changed. If Edward V was legitimate, then Richard was protector of a king. If Edward was illegitimate, then Richard could present himself not as usurper, but as the adult male heir of the Yorkist line, called forward by law, morality, and necessity. It was a shift of astonishing convenience. The guardian of the throne became, in the argument now forming, the only man fit to occupy it. This is why the abandoned coronation is so revealing. Nothing about it required an immediate confession of violence. The boys did not need to vanish yet for their political value to be attacked. First, their claim could be weakened. Their status could be altered in the public mind. They could be moved from sons of the late king to children of a disputed union, from heirs to obstacles, from sacred future to legal problem. And law, when used coldly enough, can make cruelty look tidy. Sermons, petitions, Council discussions and public declarations all helped turn private suspicion into public action. The precise pressures and motives behind these moves remain debated, but the direction is unmistakable. Edward V's coronation was not merely delayed because of practical inconvenience. It was overtaken by a campaign to redefine who he was. For the boy in the tower, this must have been the strangest kind of erasure. He had not lost a battle. He had not signed away a right. He had not spoken treason. He had simply become vulnerable to an argument made by adults outside his reach. There is something particularly chilling about that. A sword can kill a claimant, but a document can make him disappear in a different way. It can take the name history expected to give him and place it under suspicion. It can leave him alive, breathing, waiting, while the world begins rehearsing a future without him. By the summer of 1483, the coronation that should have confirmed Edward V was no longer moving toward completion. It was being replaced. In its place came a different story. That the sons of Edward IV were barred by illegitimacy, and that Richard, Duke of Gloucester, stood as the rightful answer to the kingdom's instability. The child king had not been crowned. Instead, the crown began moving toward the man who had promised to protect him. Richard III's crown was not taken from a battlefield. Not yet. It came through argument, ceremony, pressure, and the careful rearranging of legitimacy. By late June of 1483, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had moved from the role of Lord Protector into something far more permanent. The sons of Edward IV had been declared illegitimate, their claim set aside, and Richard was presented as the lawful king. To his supporters, this was not theft. It was correction. A corrupted succession had been purified. A realm threatened by faction had been steadied. A mature prince of royal blood had stepped forward where a boy's claim had failed. That was the public logic. And public logic matters, even when we suspect private ambition behind it. Medieval rulers did not usually announce themselves as opportunists. They claimed necessity. They claimed law. They claimed the good of the realm. Richard's accession followed that pattern. He did not simply seize the throne with a hand on the hilt and a smile for the chroniclers. He accepted a crown that had been made available by the political destruction of his nephew's legitimacy. But destruction on paper is not the same as destruction in memory. The problem for Richard was that Edward V and his brother Richard still existed, or at least they were believed to exist. And that was enough. Even if the boys had been declared illegitimate, they remained the sons of Edward IV in the eyes of many people who had loved, served, or benefited from Edward's reign. A legal ruling could change their status. It could not erase their faces from memory. It could not stop discontented nobles from imagining a restoration. It could not prevent rebels from using one of their names as a banner if the new king stumbled. This is the hard political reality at the center of Richard III's early reign. While the princes lived, his throne remained vulnerable. Not because every person in England was ready to rise for them, but because their existence gave opposition a shape. A rebellion needs more than anger. It needs a story. It needs someone, or something, around which scattered resentments can gather. Edward V, even uncrowned, offered that possibility. His younger brother offered another. A child hidden away in the tower could become more powerful in rumor than he had ever been in council. That does not prove Richard ordered their deaths. It does explain why suspicion attached to him so quickly and so stubbornly. He had motive in the plainest political sense. He controlled access to the boys. He benefited from their removal from the succession. And once he wore the crown, any uncertainty about their fate became inseparable from the question of his security. Still, we should be careful here. Motive is not evidence by itself. Opportunity is not confession. History has often convicted Richard III in the imagination because the story feels almost too perfectly shaped. The uncle, the nephews, the tower, the crown. It has the structure of a morality play. But real politics is messier than theater, and the surviving evidence leaves gaps large enough for centuries of argument to enter. What is not in doubt is the atmosphere Richard inherited the moment he became king. He ruled a kingdom that had been told to accept a sudden reversal of succession. He ruled while the displaced heirs were out of sight. He ruled with powerful families watching him, measuring him, and deciding whether his claim was strong enough to survive. A new king can command obedience, but he cannot command trust simply by wearing gold. And Richard's reign began under a strange kind of burden. He had solved the legal problem of his nephew's claim, yet not the emotional one. People might be persuaded that Edward IV's children were barred from inheritance. They might even repeat it publicly. But belief is rarely so obedient. In private, some would still remember Edward's sons as royal boys. Some would ask whether a parliament or council could truly turn princes into nobodies. Some would wonder why, if the boys were harmless, they remained so carefully enclosed. That last question is where the crown begins to darken. A secure king can afford visibility. He can display defeated rivals, marry them into loyalty, send them to monasteries, bind them with oaths, or keep them under watch in a way the world can understand. But hidden claimants create their own danger. They invite rumor. They make absence meaningful. Richard III may have believed his accession was justified. He may have believed the realm needed him. He may have believed, perhaps sincerely, that the Woodville faction had threatened orderly government. None of that removes the central political fact. The continued life of Edward V and his brother complicated his kingship at every level. They were children, but not politically small. Inside the tower, they had no army, no council, no coronation, no public voice. Yet outside the tower, their names still had force. That is the strange power of hereditary monarchy. A boy can be powerless in every practical sense and still be dangerous because of what other people might do in his name. So when Richard III took the crown, the mystery did not end. It narrowed. Before, the question had been whether Edward V would be crowned, then whether he had the right to be crowned. Now the question became more intimate and more disturbing. What does a new king do with the children whose existence makes his throne unsafe? There are mysteries that begin with a scream. This one begins with fewer sightings. That is part of what makes it so difficult to hold. There is no surviving moment when the doors of the tower burst open and someone cries out that the princes are gone. No clear witness steps forward in the record, trembling with a complete account. No official death notice appears to close the matter. Instead, the boys recede. At first, they were visible enough to be imagined as living children inside a royal fortress. Later accounts speak of them being seen in the Tower Gardens or at windows, watched by Londoners who understood that the sons of Edward IV were still somewhere within those walls. The details are thin and filtered through time, and we must be careful with them. But the general pattern is chilling because it is so quiet. They were seen, then seen less, and then not seen at all. For a historian, absence is a frustrating kind of evidence. It does not tell you what happened. It tells you where the record stops breathing. For a storyteller, it is almost worse. Picture the tower not as a dungeon from a later legend, but as a working royal complex in the middle of a restless city. Men came and went. Guards changed posts. Servants carried food, linen, messages, small necessities. Boats moved along the Thames. London was close enough to watch, but not close enough to know. A rumor could pass from one mouth to another before anyone had the means to test it. Inside that world were two brothers whose lives had become politically inconvenient. Edward, the elder, had already lost the crown before wearing it. Richard, the younger, had been taken from sanctuary to join him. Their mother remained outside their reach. Their sisters were entangled in the same dynastic uncertainty. Their uncle now ruled as Richard III. Then the boys began to vanish from view. This is the emotional turning point of the story, because it is where politics stops looking like procedure and begins to feel like erasure. Until now, one could still argue in the language of governance. A protector intervenes. A coronation is delayed. A legal objection is raised. A new king is proclaimed. Every action may be contested, but each still belongs to the visible world of power. The disappearance is different. It creates a private zone where explanation fails. If the princes were alive, why were they not shown? If they were dead, why was their death not announced? If they had been moved, where did they go? If they were being protected, from whom? If they were being hidden, for whose safety? Theirs, or someone else's? The precise fate of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, remains. That word has to stay in the story, even when the mind wants to push past it, especially then. The temptation is to fill the blank with the version that feels most dramatic or most morally satisfying. Richard, the murderous uncle. Henry Tudor, the calculating beneficiary. A secret escape. A servant with a guilty conscience. Bones beneath a stare. A whispered confession. Each possibility offers the comfort of shape. But the historical record does not give us that comfort cleanly. What it gives us is a narrowing circle. Two boys were placed in the tower. Their legal right to rule was attacked. Their uncle became king. They were reportedly seen for a time. Then they disappeared from public life. After that, rumor had more room than evidence. And yet, even uncertainty can accuse. Not in the simple sense of proving who killed them, because it does not, but in the deeper sense of revealing what power can do when it removes vulnerable people from sight. The boys did not need to be publicly executed to be politically erased. They only needed to stop appearing. A child claimant unseen long enough becomes a question. A question repeated long enough becomes a legend. A legend attached to a throne becomes a stain. That stain spread quickly because the disappearance made Richard III's position harder, not easier, to defend. If the princes were alive, showing them might calm suspicion, though it could also invite rebellion. If they were dead, silence looked damning. If he knew nothing, his ignorance would suggest a frightening weakness within the very fortress he controlled. Every path through the mystery led back toward power, custody, and responsibility. This is why the last glimpses matter so much. They are not just sentimental images of children at play before tragedy. They are the final points at which the princes still belong, however faintly, to the public world. A boy in a garden can be seen. A face at a window can be remembered. A child glimpsed by servants remains part of human circulation, part of ordinary witness. After that, they pass into a darker category, not confirmed dead, not confirmed living, not formally buried, not legally present in any meaningful way. For the families who had built their hopes around them, that absence must have been unbearable. For those who feared them, it may have been useful. For the kingdom, it became a wound that never quite closed because it was never properly named. The tower kept standing. Richard III kept ruling. London kept buying, selling, praying, arguing, and listening. But somewhere inside the machinery of that summer, two royal brothers slipped beyond sight. And once they did, England was left with a silence too large to ignore. Once the princes were no longer seen, the story began to leave the tower by another route. Not through doors, through rumor. Rumor is often treated as the enemy of history, and in many ways it is. It distorts, it simplifies. It gives people certainty before evidence has earned it. But rumor also tells us something valuable about fear. It reveals what people believed was possible inside their political world. And by the late summer and autumn of 1483, the possibility taking shape was terrible, that Edward V and his brother had been murdered. The difficulty is that the earliest atmosphere of suspicion survives more clearly than the crime itself. We can see that talk spread. We can see that the disappearance damaged Richard III's reputation. We can see that later generations believed the boys had been killed. What we cannot do is stand confidently in the room where it happened, because history has not preserved that room for us. Into that absence came writers. The most influential early account was associated with Thomas More, writing years after the events, under the Tudor dynasty that had defeated Richard. More's version gave the story form, character, and a kind of dreadful intimacy. In that telling, Richard becomes the calculating uncle, and the murder is carried out by agents in the tower. The account is powerful not because it is neutral, but because it is vivid. It feels like a confession whispered through a wall, even though it is not one. That distinction matters. More was not a camera. He was a writer, statesman, and moral thinker working in a political world shaped by Tudor victory. His account may preserve genuine information, court memory, or earlier testimony. It may also reflect rumor, interpretation, and the needs of a later age. Historians still debate how much weight it deserves. To dismiss it entirely is too easy. To accept it whole is also too easy. It sits in the uncomfortable middle, influential and uncertain at the same time. Then came Shakespeare. By the time Shakespeare placed Richard III on the stage, the historical king had become something larger than a man. He had become a dramatic instrument, ambition with a voice, deformity turned into metaphor, villainy sharpened for public theater. Shakespeare's Richard does not simply take power. He performs evil with such intelligence that the audience is almost forced to admire the machinery of his mind. It is brilliant drama. It is also dangerous history, because drama remembers differently. A play does not have to prove what an archive cannot. It only has to make an image unforgettable. Shakespeare gave England an unforgettable Richard, witty, ruthless, self-aware, and monstrous. From there, the murder of the princes became not merely a theory, but part of a national imagination. Many people who know almost nothing about the politics of 1483 still know the outline. The wicked uncle, the innocent nephews, the tower, the smothered children. The legend became efficient. Too efficient, perhaps. This is where we should pause and notice how memory hardens. A rumor begins as anxiety. A later account gives it a plot. A playwright gives it a face. Then centuries pass, and what was once contested starts to feel inevitable. Richard III becomes guilty because the story has trained us to expect his guilt. The Tower becomes a murder chamber because the ending has been written backward into every earlier scene. But the historian has to resist that backward pull. Richard may well have been responsible. Many serious arguments still point toward him because he had motive, access, and political need. But the image most people inherit is not built from evidence alone. It is built from Tudor memory, moral storytelling, theatrical genius, and the human appetite for a villain who can carry the full weight of a tragedy. That appetite is understandable. A clean villain makes grief easier to organize. The actual past is less obedient. The disappearance of the princes happened in a world where nearly everyone close to power had something to fear, something to gain, or something to conceal. Richard III became the central suspect not only because later writers disliked him, but because the circumstances of his reign made suspicion almost unavoidable. Yet the certainty of his guilt, as popularly imagined, owes much to pens that wrote after the boys were already gone. And so rumor became history, not in the sense that rumor begot proven fact, but in the sense that it shaped what generations believed they knew. That is one of the quieter warnings inside this mystery. When records fail, stories rush in. Some may carry truth, some may carry propaganda, some may carry both, braided so tightly that separating them becomes nearly impossible. The princes disappeared from sight, and into that darkness England poured accusation, politics, theater, and memory. By the time later centuries looked back, Richard III was no longer only a king whose nephews vanished. He was the uncle history had learned to picture standing beside their door. The most tempting version of this mystery is also the simplest. Richard III wanted the throne. The princes stood in his way. The princes disappeared. Therefore, Richard had them killed. It is a clean chain. Too clean, perhaps, but not foolish. The case against Richard begins with the brutal logic of power. He had custody, or at least effective control, over the boys. He had benefited from their declaration of illegitimacy. And once he became king, their continued survival gave his enemies a ready-made cause. Even barred from succession on paper, Edward V and his brother remained dangerous because politics does not obey paper when bloodlines are involved. That is the argument that has followed Richard for centuries. Not because it answers every question, but because it begins from the most obvious one. Who gained most immediately from the boys being removed? Richard did. Still, motive is not murder. It is only the door through which suspicion enters. The next question is opportunity. And here Richard again stands close to the center. The boys were in the Tower during his rise. The Tower was under royal authority. Access to them would not have been casual. If someone killed them there, It is difficult to imagine it happening without either permission from powerful figures or a breakdown of control so severe that it would be almost as damaging to Richard as guilt. But history rarely gives us the courtesy of a signed order. This is where Sir James Tyrell enters the story. According to later accounts, Tyrell was the man who carried out Richard's command, or helped arrange for it to be carried out. In the traditional version, he becomes the agent between royal will and private violence, not the man with the greatest motive, perhaps, but the kind of loyal servant through whom kingship can keep its hands clean while still getting what it wants. The problem is that this account reaches us through later and contested tradition. Tyrell was a real figure, and he was later executed under Henry VII, but the story connecting him directly to the murder of the princes is not as firm as popular retellings often make it sound. It may preserve something true. It may preserve confession, rumor, political convenience, or a mixture of all three. The evidence is thinner here than the legend suggests, and that thinness matters. Because once we move from Richard had motive to this named man killed them in this way, the ground becomes less solid. The more specific the story becomes, the more we have to ask who told it, when they told it, and what political world shaped the telling. A general suspicion can rest on circumstance. A detailed accusation needs stronger support. Then there is Henry VII. At first glance, Henry seems to arrive too late. He defeated Richard at Bosworth in 1485, after the princes had already vanished from public view. That timing makes him less likely as the original cause of their disappearance, if they were indeed dead by the end of Richard's reign. But Henry did benefit from a world in which Edward IV's sons were gone. His own claim to the throne was not especially clean by blood. His marriage to Elizabeth of York, the prince's sister, helped unite the rival houses and strengthen the Tudor settlement. Living sons of Edward IV would have complicated that settlement enormously. So suspicion has sometimes turned toward Henry, or toward those acting in his interest. This theory has its own political logic. Henry VII was cautious, calculating, and deeply concerned with securing his dynasty. A surviving Edward V, or a surviving Richard, Duke of York, would have been a nightmare for him. A Yorkist prince with a stronger hereditary claim and the power to attract rebellion. In fact, later pretenders would show just how useful the idea of a surviving prince could be. But again, benefit is not proof. Henry benefited from many things he did not necessarily cause. The disappearance of the princes helped clear the path for Tudor rule, but that does not tell us when they died, whether they died, or who made the decision. To make Henry the murderer, one must usually imagine that the boys survived Richard's reign in secret and were later eliminated, or that the story of their death under Richard was deliberately promoted to hide Tudor guilt. These possibilities cannot be dismissed with a wave of the hand, but they require assumptions the surviving evidence does not firmly secure. Then comes the most unsettling possibility of all: survival. What if one or both boys did not die in the tower? This idea has never fully disappeared, partly because disappearance itself leaves the door open. No confirmed bodies were publicly displayed. No unquestioned burial ended the matter. No document beyond dispute tells us the boys were killed on a particular night by particular men. In that emptiness, survival stories could grow. Some later claimants and rumors suggested that a prince had escaped, or had been hidden, or had returned under another name. These stories are fascinating, but they are also treacherous. A lost prince is one of the most useful figures in political mythology. He can rally the discontented, embarrass a ruler, attract foreign support, and give rebellion a more noble costume. The fact that people claimed a prince survived does not mean he did. But the fact that such claims were politically powerful tells us something important. England had not been given closure. Survival theories also force us to confront a strange point. If the boys lived, their silence becomes almost as mysterious as their deaths. Where were they kept? Who protected them? Why did neither emerge clearly at a moment when their names could have shaken the kingdom? How could two children of such enormous political value be preserved without leaving stronger traces? None of those questions make survival impossible. They do make it difficult. So we are left sorting motive, opportunity, and evidence, and they do not line up as neatly as a courtroom would require. Richard III had the clearest immediate motive and the strongest connection to custody. Sir James Tyrell belongs to a later tradition that may contain truth but cannot be treated as simple fact. Henry VII benefited from the prince's absence and had reason to fear any survivor, yet the timing complicates the accusation against him. Survival remains possible in the broad sense that the record does not conclusively close it. But possibility is not the same as probability. This is why the mystery has endured. Not because there are no suspects, but because there are too many ways for suspicion to attach itself to power. The princes were valuable alive, dangerous alive, useful dead, and politically explosive if rumored to have survived. Every faction around the crown had reason to shape their story. Every later regime had reason to remember the disappearance in a way that helped itself. And at the center of it all remain two children whose actual voices are almost entirely missing. The suspects cast long shadows. Richard, Tyrell, Henry, unnamed servants, hidden protectors, ambitious nobles, frightened officials. But shadows are not bodies. They can suggest a shape without proving its substance. What we can say is this: the disappearance of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, was not an accident in a quiet family corner. It happened where dynastic fear, royal custody, and political opportunity met. Someone knew more than history has preserved. Someone made a choice or allowed a choice to be made. The crime, if crime it was, did not need a monster. It only needed people who believed the future of a kingdom mattered more than the lives of two boys. The story did not stay above ground. Nearly 2 centuries after the princes vanished from sight, the tower gave up something that looked, at first glance, like an answer. In 1674, workmen were making alterations near a staircase in the White Tower when they uncovered the bones of 2 children. The place mattered. The tower mattered. The size of the remains mattered. Almost immediately, the discovery began to pull the old story toward itself, as if history had been waiting beneath the steps all along. Here, more than anywhere, the mystery turns into an object, not a rumor, not a play, not a legal argument. Bones. There is a human instinct to treat bones as final. They seem to end debate because they are physical, silent, and undeniable. A body feels like the opposite of speculation. It says, someone was here. Someone died. The past has left material behind, but bones can also deepen a mystery when the questions surrounding them are not answered carefully. The remains found in 1674 were believed by many to be those of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. That belief made emotional sense. 2 children had disappeared in the tower. 2 sets of child bones were found in the tower. The mind reaches for the connection almost before caution has time to speak. And yet caution must speak. The Tower of London was not a sealed chamber holding only one tragedy. It had been a royal fortress for centuries, a place of construction, occupation, storage, imprisonment, ceremony, and death. Human remains found there may be important without being automatically identifiable. The discovery location was suggestive, but suggestion is not proof. The number and apparent age of the bones seemed to fit the missing princes, but seemed to fit is not the same as has been demonstrated. Still, the 17th century did not have modern forensic science waiting in the next room. It had tradition, royal authority, and a powerful need to settle an old wound. The bones were eventually placed in Westminster Abbey, in an urn, under the belief that they belonged to the lost princes. There is something strangely moving about that. If they were Edward and Richard, then after generations of uncertainty, the boys were finally carried from the tower to a royal resting place. Not with the funeral rites they should have received as sons of a king, but with a kind of delayed national recognition. If they were not the princes, then the gesture becomes something more complicated. An act of reverence built on uncertainty, honoring one mystery with the remains of another. That possibility should make us uncomfortable, but not cynical. People in the past were not foolish simply because they lacked our tools. They were trying to make meaning from what they had. They saw 2 children's bones beneath a staircase in the very fortress where 2 royal children had vanished, and they believed the earth had finally answered. The problem is that belief hardened into memory faster than evidence hardened into proof. The urn in Westminster Abbey became part of the story. Visitors, writers, historians, and the public imagination could now point to a physical resting place. The princes were no longer only absent. They had a presumed tomb. That changed the tone of the mystery. It gave grief a location. It gave accusation a heavier weight, and it made the murder theory feel more tangible, because bones beneath stairs sound like the kind of detail no novelist would dare invent without being accused of trying too hard. But the historian's task is not to be impressed by symbolism alone. The 1674 discovery is significant. It cannot be ignored. It is one of the most important material clues connected to the disappearance. Yet it does not solve the case by itself. We do not know with certainty that the remains are those of Edward V and his brother. We do not know exactly how they died. We do not know when they died. We do not know whether their placement, if deliberate, was meant to conceal a crime, or whether later disturbance confused the context. The staircase gives us an image, not a verdict. And that image is powerful. 2 small bodies hidden below the architecture of royal power. Children literally beneath the steps of a fortress where kings were lodged, guarded, and sometimes destroyed. It is almost too symbolic. That is precisely why we have to handle it gently. The past does not become truer because it resembles a parable. For supporters of Richard's guilt, the bones seem to confirm what rumor had long accused. For those more skeptical, they raised as many questions as they answered. Why were the remains there? Were they complete? Had they been moved? Could they belong to other children? Were the early descriptions reliable? How much had been lost before anyone understood what careful preservation would require? By the time the bones entered Westminster Abbey, They had already entered legend, and legend has a way of protecting evidence from examination while also depending on it. The urn became sacred, not only religiously, but historically. To open it again would mean disturbing more than remains. It would mean disturbing a national story, a royal tomb, and a centuries-old compromise between uncertainty and commemoration. So the bones beneath the stairs stand at the center of a strange tension. They may be the strongest physical trace of the princes. They may also be a reminder that physical traces, without secure identification, can tempt us into premature certainty. The tower had offered something solid. England accepted it as an answer, or close enough to one. But beneath that acceptance, the same old silence remained. 2 children had vanished. 2 sets of bones had been found. Between those facts lay a gap that no inscription could fully close. The urn gave the princes a resting place. It did not give history a confession. The bones were examined again in 1933. By then, the world had changed enough to ask new questions, but not enough to answer them cleanly. Forensic science had begun to offer tools that earlier centuries did not possess. Measurements could be taken. Teeth could be studied. Age could be estimated. The remains in the Westminster Abbey urn were no longer only relics of a national story. They were evidence, or at least potential evidence, waiting under royal and religious protection. The examination was important, but it was not the final revelation people sometimes imagine. Those who studied the bones concluded that they belonged to children of ages broadly compatible with Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. That mattered. It meant the old identification could not simply be dismissed as fantasy. The remains were not, for example, obviously those of adults or of children whose ages made the connection impossible. But compatibility is a cautious word. It does not mean certainty. The 1933 examination could not identify the children by name. It could not prove royal blood. It could not establish a precise cause of death beyond dispute. It could not tell us who placed the bones where they were found, or whether all the remains belonged to only 2 individuals without complication. And because the bones had already been discovered, handled, moved, interpreted, and enshrined long before modern standards of evidence, the chain of custody was far from ideal. This is one of the less romantic truths about historical mysteries. Evidence ages, but so do our mistakes. Every century that touches an object leaves something behind. A hand, a label, a decision, a missing note, a well-meaning rearrangement. By the time science arrives, it may not be meeting the past in its original state. It may be meeting the past after generations of human interference. That is why the urn in Westminster Abbey has become both a promise and a barrier. Modern DNA testing seems, at first, like the obvious next step. If the remains could be sampled and compared with known relatives from the wider royal line, perhaps the question of identity could be narrowed. Perhaps the bones could be confirmed as the princes. Perhaps they could be ruled out. Perhaps, after 5 centuries, the mystery could be shifted from legend toward laboratory finding. It sounds simple only until one begins counting the complications. First, there is the matter of permission. These remains are not stored in an ordinary archive drawer. They are held in Westminster Abbey within a royal and sacred context, long associated with 2 lost children of the English monarchy. Opening the urn would not be merely a technical procedure. It would be a symbolic act. and symbols are guarded more fiercely than people admit. Then there is contamination. The bones were found in the 17th century, examined, moved, and preserved according to the practices and assumptions of earlier times. Any modern test would have to reckon with the possibility that later handling introduced material that could confuse results. DNA can be powerful, but it is not magic. It cannot always repair what centuries have disturbed. There is also the question of what a result would actually prove. A successful test might tell us whether the bones plausibly belong to the family of Edward IV. That would be a major development. But even then, identity would not necessarily reveal the full story. Confirming the remains as those of the princes would not automatically name the killer. It would not tell us whether Richard III ordered their deaths, whether someone acted without his command, whether they died from illness, neglect, or violence, or whether the traditional murder story is accurate in its details. Science might answer the question, who are they? It might still leave untouched the question, what happened? And if the bones were shown not to be the princes, the mystery would not become smaller. It would widen. The supposed resting place would be emptied of certainty, and the fate of Edward and Richard would become even more elusive. The Tower would still have lost 2 children. Westminster would simply have been guarding the wrong remains. That possibility is one reason this debate carries such emotional force. DNA testing offers hope, but it also threatens a form of closure that, however imperfect, has existed for centuries. Some people want the truth badly enough to disturb the urn. Others argue that the dead should not be unsettled for a question that science may answer only partially. Between those positions lies a genuine tension, not just between curiosity and reverence, but between history as investigation and history as memorial. The princes are not only subjects of research, they are also children believed by many to have been victims. That matters. There is a kind of hunger that can develop around famous mysteries, a desire to open every sealed thing, test every fragment, force the past into confession. Sometimes that hunger produces knowledge. Sometimes it forgets that human remains are not props in a puzzle. The best historical inquiry has to hold both truths at once, the need to know and the need to treat the dead as more than evidence. The locked urn, therefore, becomes one of the most haunting objects in the entire story. Not because it certainly contains Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. It may not, but because it holds the shape of our uncertainty so perfectly. Inside may be the answer to one of England's darkest royal questions. Or inside may be a reminder that even our answers can be misidentified, polished, labeled, and placed beneath a monument. For now, the remains are still there, protected by stone, tradition, and refusal. Science waits outside the lid. History waits with it. And the silence, for the moment, remains officially undisturbed. Recent evidence checked for this section includes Professor Tim Thornton's 2024 work on Edward V's chain and the Capel/Tyrell connection, which he explicitly frames as significant, but not a smoking gun, plus recent summaries of Philippa Langley's survival argument and the continuing dispute around it. Even after centuries, the mystery refuses to behave like an old story. It keeps producing new doors. Some are opened by scholars in archives, turning brittle pages and noticing a name that earlier readers passed over. Some are opened by documentary crews, public debate, and the stubborn energy of people who believe the traditional version has been accepted too easily. Some doors lead somewhere useful. Others lead into rooms crowded with hope, theory, and overstatement. That is the danger of this case in its modern form. The princes are no longer only historical figures. They are also a kind of test. A test of how we handle uncertainty when new fragments appear. A test of whether we can be excited by evidence without forcing it to say more than it says. In recent years, one of the most attention-grabbing lines of argument has come from research suggesting that one or both princes may have survived the tower. These claims have been associated especially with the Missing Princes Project and Philippa Langley, whose earlier work on Richard III helped change one of the most famous archaeological searches in English history. That reputation gives the survival theory a certain public force. People listen, because once in a while history really does leave a king under a car park. But survival is a harder claim than discovery. The argument points to documents, foreign connections, later rebellions, and possible references to sons of Edward IV, living beyond the moment when they were traditionally assumed dead. It asks us to look again at figures often dismissed as pretenders. It suggests that the official Tudor explanation may have been too convenient, and that Henry VII's regime had every reason to crush or redefine any surviving Yorkist prince. Marked carefully, this is, not because it is uninteresting, it is extremely interesting. Not because the scholars and researchers involved have found nothing. They have brought attention to material that deserves examination. But a document that appears to refer to a son of Edward IV does not automatically prove that Edward V, or Richard, Duke of York, escaped the tower. A claimant in Europe does not automatically become a lost prince. A political rebellion using a royal identity does not, by itself, confirm the identity was true. Late medieval politics was full of masks, useful names, coerced confessions, convenient silences, and men who became valuable because others believed they might be someone else. That is why the survival theories are so fascinating and so difficult. They do not merely ask, could the boys have lived? They ask whether entire later episodes of Tudor instability have been misunderstood. If Edward V survived, or if his brother survived, then the story of the tower changes from murder to concealment, escape, and eventual suppression. Richard III's reputation changes. Henry VII's early reign changes. Even the meaning of later pretenders changes. But the larger the revision, the heavier the evidence must be. Then, from the other side of the mystery, came a different kind of recent clue. Not a living prince, but a possession. A will from the early 16th century has drawn attention because it appears to connect a chain belonging to Edward V with the family circle of Lady Margaret Capel, who was linked by marriage to Sir James Tyrell. Tyrell, in the traditional account, is the man said to have arranged the killing of the princes on Richard III's orders. If Edward's personal chain really passed into that network, the implication is uncomfortable. Why would a treasured object associated with the missing boy king end up there? This too must be marked with care, in its strongest interpretation. The chain is important. Its ownership trail may matter. Its connection to people near Tyrell is suggestive, but it does not, on its own, prove murder. It does not show the boys dying. It does not prove Tyrell received the object as reward, trophy, proof, or loot. There may have been other routes by which royal goods were dispersed after the princes were declared illegitimate and removed from public life. And yet the clue cannot be brushed aside either. Objects have their own quiet testimony. They do not speak in full sentences, but they disturb the room. A royal chain is not a scrap of anonymous cloth. It is personal, symbolic, tied to identity and status. If such an object can be placed near families connected to the traditional murder story, then historians are right to look closely, not to declare the case solved, to ask whether an old account, long dismissed by some as propaganda, may contain more remembered truth than its critics allow. So the modern mystery now has pressure from both directions. One pressure says, perhaps the princes lived, and the murder story was a political fiction that hardened over time. The other says, perhaps the murder story, however shaped by later writers, has been circling a real event all along. Between them stands the same old problem. Evidence arrives in fragments. Interpretation does the rest. This is not a weakness of the story. It is the story. The disappearance of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, happened at the edge of record and rumor. That edge has never stopped moving. Each generation brings its own tools. The Tudors brought propaganda and statecraft. Shakespeare brought theater. The 17th century brought bones. The 20th century brought forensic measurement. The 21st brings DNA debates, archive projects, television reconstructions, and a public that wants cold cases to end with the clean snap of a solved crime. But the 15th century does not owe us that satisfaction. What recent work has truly done is not close the case. It has reopened the discipline of looking. It has reminded us that the mystery is not frozen inside one Victorian painting of two frightened boys. It lives in wills, receipts, chains, political claims, foreign archives, family connections, and the uncomfortable spaces between official stories. That is valuable, even when the conclusions remain. Because a mystery kept alive only by atmosphere eventually becomes entertainment. A mystery kept alive by evidence, even partial and disputed evidence, remains history. It forces us to sharpen our questions. What counts as proof? How much weight can one document bear? When does skepticism become refusal? When does belief become wishful thinking? The princes have survived in public memory partly because they were never conclusively found, but they have also survived because every proposed answer leaves something behind that does not fit neatly. If Richard killed them, why no clear official trace? If they survived, why no uncontested return? If Tyrell confessed, why does the evidence around that confession remain so difficult? If the bones are theirs, why has science not been allowed to settle even that part? If the chain matters, what exactly does it prove? These are not decorative questions. They are the architecture of the case. The newest clues do not bring us into daylight. They bring us into a different darkness, one with more labels on the shelves, more names in the files, more reasons to hesitate before closing the lid. The mystery is not dead. It is being re-examined, contested, defended, revived, and sometimes marketed, which is perhaps the most modern fate any medieval tragedy can suffer. Still, beneath the arguments, the human center remains unchanged. Two boys disappeared from the tower. Everything since has been an attempt to explain the silence they left behind. There is a reason the princes in the tower have never become merely a footnote. England has had no shortage of violent successions, broken oaths, suspicious deaths, and rulers who discovered that family feeling becomes flexible when a crown is nearby. The 15th century was not a gentle place suddenly interrupted by one dark act. It was a political world in which bloodlines promised order and then repeatedly delivered war. And yet this disappearance still feels different, perhaps because Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, were not defeated kings in armor. They were not rebel dukes captured after a failed rising. They were not adult players who had spent years moving pieces across the board. They were children born into a game they had no power to refuse. That does not make them politically unimportant. It makes the opposite true. Their tragedy is that childhood did not protect them from significance. They were young enough to be frightened, dependent, and easily controlled. They were also royal enough to threaten governments simply by breathing. That is the cruel contradiction at the center of their story. A child should be allowed to be small. A prince is not. From the moment Edward IV died, his sons became the living hinge on which the future might swing. Their names could authorize rule, rebellion, marriage, legitimacy, revenge. Their bodies could be hidden, displayed, guarded, moved, or perhaps destroyed. They were not treated only as boys because monarchy had made them into evidence. Evidence of a line, evidence of a claim, evidence of a future that other people might not survive. The Tower of London still stands because stone is better at enduring than truth. It has watched kings enter, queens fall, prisoners wait, tourists gather, ravens hop about with the solemn importance of minor officials. It has become museum, monument, symbol, and stage. But for this story, it remains most powerful as a place of withheld knowledge. Somewhere within its history, two royal brothers passed out of public sight. That is the fact that resists ornament. They may have been murdered on Richard III's orders. That remains the most famous, and to many historians the most politically direct explanation. Richard had motive. He had proximity. He had the problem of two inconvenient nephews whose existence weakened the security of his new crown. Or the boys may have died through some other arrangement, by agents acting with or without clear command, in a world where obedience and initiative could blur dangerously around royal wishes. Sir James Tyrell's name remains attached to that tradition, but the evidence linking him to the act is still debated. Or one or both boys may have survived longer than the traditional story allows. That possibility has never fully vanished, because no public body, no uncontested grave, and no complete contemporary explanation closed the matter. Survival theories remain intriguing, but they carry their own burdens. A hidden prince is easy to imagine and difficult to prove. The bones in Westminster Abbey may be theirs. They may not be. Science may one day be allowed to test them more fully. Or the urn may remain sealed, preserving not certainty, but a kind of official restraint. And perhaps that is why the story continues to trouble us. It is not only that two children may have been killed, it is that power erased them so thoroughly that even certainty disappeared. No final letter in Edward's hand explains his fear. No diary from Richard, Duke of York, tells us how he understood the narrowing world around him. No guard's confession survives beyond dispute. No royal order, clean and damning, lies waiting in the archive. What remains is a pattern. Custody, delay, illegitimacy, accession, disappearance, rumor, bones, argument. A chain of events strong enough to disturb, incomplete enough to divide. In that incompleteness, every generation finds something of itself. The Tudors found a villain useful to their legitimacy. Shakespeare found a character dark enough to fill a stage. Antiquarians found bones and wanted them to speak. Modern investigators find documents, family links, DNA questions, and the possibility that older assumptions may not be as settled as they look. And viewers now, sitting centuries away from the summer of 1483, find a mystery that feels almost modern in its unease. Two children placed inside an institution, removed from sight, and explained only by the people who benefited from their silence. That is why the princes in the tower still haunt English history, not because the story is perfectly known, because it is not. Their disappearance exposes the limit of monarchy's grandeur. Crowns glitter, ceremonies bless, genealogies claim divine order. But behind all of that, power often depends on control over bodies. Who may be seen, who may be named, who may inherit, who may disappear without answer. Edward V was never crowned. Richard, Duke of York, never grew into the adult his bloodline promised or threatened. Their sister Elizabeth would become queen beside Henry VII, helping to stitch together the houses that had torn England apart. Richard III would die at Bosworth, his reign brief and forever shadowed. Henry VII would build a dynasty careful, anxious, and determined to survive. England would move on, because kingdoms always move on. That is one of their less admirable talents, but the children did not move on with it. They remained fixed at the edge of history, forever young, forever almost seen, at a window, in a garden, in a rumor, beneath a staircase, inside a sealed urn. The temptation, at the end, is to choose an answer and make the darkness orderly. To say, this is what happened, this is who did it, this is where the story ends. But honesty requires a quieter conclusion. Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, disappeared from the Tower of London in 1483. Their fate remains. The most responsible history can narrow the field. It can weigh motive, opportunity, and evidence. It can strip away theatrical exaggeration and still admit that suspicion remains. It can show why Richard III stands so close to the center of the case, why Henry VII benefited from the absence, why Tyrell's name will not leave the story, why the bones matter, and why none of these things quite closes the door. And so the final image is not a solved crime scene. It is the tower at evening, its walls warmed briefly by the last light, while the river moves as it always has. It is Westminster Abbey, where an urn rests under the weight of a name that may or may not be true. It is a kingdom that built itself on inheritance, then lost two heirs so completely that even their deaths cannot be spoken without caution. The mystery of the princes in the tower endures because it asks a question larger than who gave the order. It asks what happens when children become obstacles to power. And after more than 500 years, England is still listening at the door.